Chapter 226 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 226. The Strange Guest, the Little Chapel, Varney's Narrative. Mr. Bevan could not but see that he had made some impression, even upon the obdurate heart of Varney, and he was determined to follow that impression up by every means in his power. "Always have in mind," he said, "that by trusting me you trust one who is not in the habit of condemning his fellows. You will be safe from anything like sanctified reproach; for, to my thinking, religion should be a principle of love and tenderness, and not a subject upon which people who, perhaps, are themselves liable and obnoxious to all sorts of reproach, should deal forth denunciations against their neighbors. Is that indeed your faith?" "It is, and it is the real faith, taught by my great master. You are as one among many thousands. Nay, you may have been unfortunate in meeting with bad specimens of those who are devoted in the priesthood. Do not condemn hastily." "Hastily! I have been some hundreds of years in condemning. You will come with me." "I will, for once again, put faith in human nature." "Tell me, then, before we leave this spot, if you know aught of what has happened to, or become of the body of Clara Croton." "I can tell you it was left here buried, but uncovered." "Indeed, the ground is level, and I see no trace of a grave." "No, I have obliterated all such traces. I have placed the earth upon her. May she now rest in peace. Oh, that such a flower should have been so rudely plucked, and I the cause! Is not that enough to make heaven's angels mutiny if I should essay to pass the golden gates? Say no more of that. I thank God that the body is so disposed of, and that it will not come in the way of any of the Crofton family. This affair had far better now be let sink into oblivion. Alas! Poor Sir George is now the most pitiable sufferer. Indeed! Yes, madness has seized upon him. He only sits and smiles to himself, weaving in his imagination strange fancies. And you call that unhappy? It is called, and considered so. Oh, fatal error! He is happy. Reason, boasted, godlike reason! What are you but the curse of poor humanity? The maniac who will in his cell fancy it a gorgeous hall, and of the damp straw that is his couch make up a glittering coronet, is a king indeed, and most happy." "That is poetical," said Mr. Bevan, "if not true." "It is true." "Well, well, we will talk on that as well as other themes at our leisure. Come on, and I will at once take you to my home, where you will be safe, and I hope more happy. Are you not afraid?" "I am not." "You are right. Confidence is safety. Lead on, sir. I'll follow you, although I little thought to make any human companionship to-night." Mr. Bevan walked only about a step in advance as they proceeded toward the parsonage house, and on the way he conversed with Varney with calmness which, considering the very peculiar circumstances, few men could have brought to bear upon the occasion. But Mr. Bevan was no common man. He looked upon nature and all the living creatures that make up its vital portion with peculiar eyes, and if the bishop of his diocese had known one half of what Mr. Bevan thought, he would not have suffered him to remain in his religious situation. But he kept the mass of his liberal opinions to himself, although he always acted upon them, and a man more completely free from sectarian dogmas and illiberal fancies of superstition, which are nicknamed faith, could not be. There was still, notwithstanding all the circumstances, a hope lingering in his mind that Varney might, after all, not be even what he thought himself to be, but some enthusiast who had dreamt himself into a belief of his own horrible powers. We know that such was not the case, but it was natural enough for Mr. Bevan to hold as long as he could by such an idea. And so those two most strangely assorted beings, the clergyman and the vampire, walked together towards the pretty and picturesque dwelling of the former. "The distance is short," said Mr. Bevan. "Nay, that matters not," replied Varney. "I spoke because I thought you seemed fatigued." No, my frame is of iron. My heart is bowed down with many griefs, but the physical structure knows no feeling of dejection. The life I possess is no common one. Oh, would that it were so, that I might shuffle it off as ordinary men can do! Do not say that. Who knows but that after all your living accomplishes better things? I cannot say that it accomplishes aught completely but one thing, and that is my most exquisite misery. Even that may pass away. But here we are at my little garden gate. Come in and fear nothing, for if you will seek heaven as I would wish you, you will find this place such a haven of peace, and such a refuge against the storms of life, as you hardly fancied existed, I dare say, in this world. Not for me. I did not fancy that there existed a spot on earth on which I could lie down in peace, and yet it may be here. End of chapter 226. Chapter 227 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 227. Varney opens the vast storehouse of his memory. A more singular conversation than that which took place between Varney the Vampyre and this minister of religion could not be conceived. If there was any one particle of goodness existing in Varney's disposition, we may suspect it would now be developed. Perhaps the whole domestic history of the world never yet exhibited so remarkable an association as that between Mr. Bevan and Varney. And when they sat down together in the little cheerful study of the former, never had four walls enclosed two beings of the same species, and yet of such opposite pursuits. But we can hardly call Varney the Vampyre human. His space of existence had been lengthened out beyond the ordinary routine of human existence, and the kind of vitality that he now enjoyed, if one might be allowed the expression, was something distinct and peculiar. It speaks volumes, however, for the philanthropy and liberality of the minister of any religion who could hold out the hand of fellowship to so revolting and to so horrible an existence. But Mr. Bevan was no common man. His religion was doctrinal, certainly, but it was free from bigotry, and his charity to the feelings, opinions, and prejudices of others was immense. He was accustomed to say, "May not my feelings be prejudices?" And one of the sublimest precepts of the whole Scriptures was to him that which says, "Judge not, lest ye too should be judged." Hence it was that he would not allow himself to revolt at Varney. It had seemed right to the great Creator of all things that there should be such a being, and therefore he, Mr. Bevan, would neither question nor condemn it. "Look about you," he said to Varney, with a disordered gaze. "You seem to look very about you, as if there was a danger in the atmosphere you breathe. But be assured you are safe here. It shall be my life for your life, if any harm should be attempted to be done you." Varney looked at him for a few moments' silence, and then in his deep and sepulchral voice he spoke, saying, "My race is run." "What mean you by that expression?" "I mean I shall no longer be a terror to the weak, nor a curiosity to the strong. In time past, more than once I have tried to shuffle off the evil of this frightful existence, but some accident, strange, wild, and wonderful, has brought me back to life again." "Perhaps not an accident," said Mr. Bevan. "You may be right. But when I have sought to rid the world of my own bad company, I have been moved to do so by some act of kindness and consideration, most contrary to my deserts; and then again, when I have been cast back by the waves of fate upon the shores of existence, my heart is burdened, and I have begun to plan to work mischief and misery and woe to all. I can understand how your feelings have alternated, but I hope that our association will have better result." "Yes, a better result, for with consummate art, with cool perseverance, and extended knowledge, I trust I may think of some things which cannot fail of changing this living frame to that dust from which it sprung, and to which it should long since have returned." "You believe in that? But do you not think there is a pure spirit that will yet live, independent of the groveling earth? There are times when I have hoped that even that fable were true. but you have promised me rest. Will you keep your word?" "That I will, most certainly. But will you keep yours? You have promised me some details of your extraordinary existence, and as a divine, and I hope in some degree as a philosopher, I look for them with some degree of anxiety." "You shall have them. Leave me pens, ink, and paper, and in the solitude of this room until to-morrow morning, and you shall have what I believe to be the origin of this most horrible career. Your wishes shall be consulted, but will you not take refreshment?" "Nothing, nothing. My refreshment is one I need not name to you, and when forced by the world's customs and considerations of my own safety, I have partaken of man's usual food, it has but ill accorded with my preternatural existence. I eat not, drink not, here. You know me as I am." As he continued speaking, Varney evidently grew weaker, and Mr. Bevan could scarcely persuade himself that it was not through actual want of nourishment; but the vampire assured him it was not so, and that rest would recruit him, to which opinion, as the experience of human nature generally afforded no index to Varney's peculiar habits, he was forced to subscribe. There was a couch in the room, and upon that Varney laid himself; and as he seemed indisposed for further conversation, Mr. Bevan left him, promising to return to him, as he himself requested, in the morning, with the hope of finding that he had completed some sort of narrative to the effect mentioned. It can scarcely be said that Mr. Bevan had thoroughly made up his mind to leave his guest for so long a period, and as there was a window that looked from the study in his little garden, he thought that by now and then peeping in, to see that all was right, he could scarcely be considered as breaking faith with his mysterious guest. "He will surely attempt nothing against his own life," thought Mr. Bevan, "for already he seems to be impressed with the futility of such an attempt, and to think that when he has made them he has been made the sport of circumstances that had forced him back to life again, despite all his wishes to the contrary." Mr. Bevan reasoned thus, but he knew little what was passing in the mind of Varney the Vampire. After about 2 hours more, when the night was profoundly dark, the liberal-minded but anxious clergyman went into his garden for the purpose of peeping into his study, and he then saw, as he supposed, his visitor lying enveloped in his large brown cloak, lying upon the couch. He was better pleased to see he was sleeping, and recovering from the great fatigue of which he complained, instead of writing, although that writing promised to be of so interesting a character, and he crept softly away for fear of awakening him. The hour had now arrived at which Mr. Bevan usually retired to rest, but he delayed doing so, and let 2 hours more elapse, after which he again stole out of his garden and peeped into the study. There lay the long, gaunt, slumbering figure upon the couch. "I am satisfied," said Mr. Bevan to himself. "Fatigue has completely overcome him, and he will sleep till morning now. I long much to become acquainted with his strange eventful history." After this, Mr. Bevan retired to rest, but not until in prayer he had offered up his thanks, and stated his hopes of being able to turn aside from the wicked path he had been pursuing the wretched man who at that moment was slumbering peacefully beneath his roof. We should have less of opposition to churchmen if they were all like Mr. Bevan, and not the wily, ravenous, illiberal, grasping crew they really are. There was no priestcraft in him. He was almost enough to make one in love with his doctrines, be they what they might, so that they were his. Although we say that he retired to rest, we should more properly say he retired to try to rest, for after all there were feelings of excitement and anxiety about him which he could not repress wholly, and although he had every reason to believe his guest was sleeping, and calmly sleeping too, yet he found he was becoming painfully alive to the slightest sound. He became nervously alive to the least interruption, and kept fancying that he heard the slightest indications of movements in the house, such as at any other time he would have paid no attention to. It always happened, too, provokingly, that just as he was dropping into a slight slumber, that he thought he heard one of these noises, and then he would start awake and sit up in his bed, and listen attentively until tired nature forced him to repose again. Those who have passed such a night of watchfulness need not be told how very, very exciting it becomes, and hour after hour becomes more intense and acute, and the power of escaping its fell influence less and less. Indeed, it was not until the dawn of morning that Mr. Bevan tasted the sweets of sound repose. Then, as is generally usual after nights of fever and disquietude, the cool, pure, life-giving air of early morn produced quite a different state of feeling, and his repose was calm and serene. End of chapter 227. Chapter 228 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 228. The Flight of the Vampire. The Mass. As was to be expected, in consequence of the sleepless state in which he had been in the early part of the night, Mr. Bevan did not awaken at his usually early hour; and as his confidential servant had stolen into his room upon tiptoe, and seen that he was sleeping quietly and soundly, she did not think proper to disturb him. An autumnal sun was gleaming into his lattice window when he spontaneously awoke, and the reflection of the sunlight upon a particular portion of the wall convinced him that it was late. For a moment or two he lay in that dreamy state when we are just conscious of where we are, without having the smallest pretensions to another idea, and probably he would have dropped to sleep again had it not been that his servant again opened the door, the lock of which had the infirmity of giving a peculiar snap every time it was used, and that thoroughly awakened him. "Oh, you are awake, sir?" said his old servant. "I never knew you sleep so long. Breakfast has been ready an hour and a half. It's a cool morning, sir, and what's worse, I can't get into your study to light you a bit of fire, which I thought you would want." The interruption altogether, and the mention of the study, served completely to arouse Mr. Bevan to a remembrance of the events of the preceding evening, and he cried, "What's the time? What's the time?" "It's after 9, and as for the study—" "Never mind the study, never mind the study. I will be down directly." Scarcely ever had Mr. Bevan dressed himself with such precipitation as he now did. How provoking, he thought, that upon this particular occasion, when I should like to have been up and stirring earlier than usual, I am a good hour and a half later. It can't be helped, though, and if my guest of last night is to be credited, he won't be waiting for his breakfast. The simple toilet of the kind-hearted clergyman was soon completed, and then he ran downstairs to the lower part of his house, and finding that his servant was in the kitchen, he thought he might at once proceed to his study to speak to the extraordinary inmate. He had furnished Varney with the means of locking himself in for the night, and it would seem that the vampire had fully availed himself of those means, for when Mr. Bevan tried the door, he found himself as much at fault as his servant had been, and could not by any means effect an admittance. "He said his fatigue was great," remarked Mr. Bevan, "and so it seems it was, for surely he is yet sleeping. It is a comfort when one oversleeps oneself that the necessity for one's rising has been put off by the same means." Unwilling to disturb Varney, and not hearing from the slightest movement from within that he had yet done so, Mr. Bevan went to his breakfast, much better satisfied than he had been a quarter of an hour since; and as the breakfast-room adjoined the study, he had every opportunity, if the vampire should be stirring, of hearing and attending to him. Not above 10 minutes elapsed in this kind of way, when Mr. Bevan, although he saw nothing of his guest, heard something of the approach of a visitor by the trampling of feet upon the gravel walk, and upon looking through the window he saw that it was his friend Sir George Crofton from the Hall. It was rather an early hour for visitors, but still, under the peculiar circumstances, Sir George might be supposed not to stand upon ceremony in calling upon the clergyman of his parish and upon his old friend, combining, as Mr. Bevan did, both these characters in one. It was rather, though, placing the clergyman in a situation of difficulty, for while there was nothing he so much hated as mystery and concealment, he yet could not, upon the spur of the moment, decide whether he ought to inform Sir George of the presence of Varney or not. After the frightful manner in which the Baronet and his family had suffered from what might be called the machinations of the vampire, it could scarcely be supposed that his feelings were otherwise than in a most exasperated state, and it might, for all he knew, be actually dangerous for the personal safety of that guest whom he had pledged his honor to protect, to allow Sir George Crofton to know at all that he was beneath his roof. While he was engaged in these considerations, and before he could come to anything like a conclusion concerning them, Sir George was announced and shown as a privileged visitor into the parlor. We cannot but pause to make a remark upon the stupendous change that had taken place in the appearance of that unhappy man. When first we presented him to the reader, he was as good a specimen of the hale, hearty English gentleman as we could wish to see. Good humour and good health beamed forth on every feature of his face, and well they might do so, for although the past had not been uncheckered by trials, the future wore to him a sunny aspect, and some of the feelings of his youth were returning to him in the happiness of his children. But what a change was now! 20 years of ordinary existence, with extraordinary vicissitudes, would scarcely have produced the effect that the events of the last fortnight had upon that unhappy father. He appeared to be absolutely sinking into the grave with grief, and not only was his countenance strangely altered, but the tones of his voice were completely changed from what they had been. Alas! Poor Sir George Crofton, never will the light of joy again illumine your face. There are griefs, inevitable griefs, which time will heal, griefs which the more we look upon them, the more we find our reason array itself against them. But his sorrows were of a different complexion, and were apt to grow more gigantic from thought. "Good morning, Mr. Bevan," he said. "I am an early visitor, sir." "Not more early than welcome, Sir George. I pray you to be seated." "You are very good," said the Baronet. "But when one comes at an hour like this, I am of opinion that he ought to come with something like a good excuse for his intrusion." "There is none needed, I assure you. But I have been thinking upon the advice which you have given me, Mr. Bevan, to leave this part of the country, and try the endeavor by the excitement and changes of foreign travel to lessen the weight of my calamities." "I think your determination is a good one, Sir George." "Probably it is the best I could adopt, but I must confess that I should set about it in better spirit, but I am haunted by apprehensions." "Apprehensions, Sir George! Is not the worst past?" "It may be, and I hope to heaven it is, but I have another child, another daughter, fair and beautiful as my lost Clara. But what security have I that that dreadful being may not pursue her, and with frightful vindictiveness drive her to the grave?" Mr. Bevan was silent 2 or 3 minutes, and the idea crossed him that if he could get Sir George in the proper state of mind, it would be, perhaps, better that he should know that the vampire was in the house, and in such a state of mind as not to renew any outrages against him or his family, than that he should go abroad with the dread clinging to him of still being followed and persecuted by that dreadful being. "Sir George," said Mr. Bevan, in an extremely serious voice, "Sir George, did you ever reason with yourself calmly and seriously, and in a Christian spirit, about this affair?" "Calmly, Mr. Bevan! How could I reason calmly?" "I have scarcely put my question as I ought. What I meant to ask was, what are your personal feelings towards the vampire? We must recollect that even he, dreadful existence as he is, was fashioned by the same God that fashioned us, and who shall say but he may be the victim of a horrible and stern necessity? Who shall say but he may be tortured by remorse, and that the circumstances connected with your daughter, of which you so justly complain, may be to him sources of the bitterest reflection? What if you were to be assured that never more would that mysterious man cross your path, if man we can call him? Do you think that you could then forgive him? It is hard to say, but the feeling that my other child was safe would prompt me much. Sir George, I could make a communication to you if I thought you would listen to it patiently, if you will swear to me to be calm." "I swear! Tell me, oh, tell me!" "The vampire is in this house." End of chapter 228. Chapter 229 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 229. The Mysterious Disappearance. One may form some sort of judgment of the astonishment with which Sir George Crofton heard this statement. He looked indeed a few moments at Mr. Bevan, as if he had a strong suspicion that he could not possibly have heard aright, so that the good clergyman was induced to repeat his statement, which he did by saying, "Sir George, I assure you, however remarkable such a circumstance may be and however much you may feel yourself surprised at it, that in the extreme bitterness of spirit and feeling all the compunction that you could possibly wish him to feel, Varney the Vampyre is now an inmate of this house." Had a bombshell fallen at his feet, Sir George Crofton could not have felt more surprised, and he exhibited that surprise by several times repeating to himself, "Varney the Vampyre, an inmate of this house. Varney the Vampyre, here." "Yes," said Mr. Bevan, "here, an inmate of this house. He is within a few paces of you, slumbering in the next apartment, and from his own lips you shall have the assurance that never again will you have any trouble on his account, and that he most bitterly and most deeply regrets the suffering he had brought upon you and yours." "Will that regret," said Sir George excitedly, "restore the dead? Will that regret give me my child again? Will it open the portals of the grave and restore her to me, who was the life and joy of my existence? Tell me, will it do that? If not, what is his regret to me?" "No, Sir George, no. His regret will not do that. There is such power, but it is not upon earth. Heaven delegates not such fearful responsibilities to any of its creatures, and the only reason which has induced me to make this confidence was to take from you the fearful anxiety of fancying yourself followed by that dreadful being." "Vengeance," replied Sir George Crofton, "vengeance shall be mine. In the name of my lost child, I cry for vengeance. Shall he not perish who has made her whom I love perish? Make way, Mr. Bevan, make way!" "No, Sir George, no. This is my house. I, as a Christian minister, offered the hospitality of its roof to Varney the Vampyre, and I cannot violate my word." "You speak, sir, to a desperate man!" cried Sir George. "No roof to me is sanctified, beneath which the murderer of my child finds a shelter. Mr. Bevan, the respect that one man has for another, or ever has had for another, cannot exceed the respect I have for you. But with all that, sir, I cannot forget my own personal wrongs. The shade of my murdered Clara beckons me." "Fly, Varney, fly!" cried Mr. Bevan. "Fly!" "Is it so?" said Sir George. "Do you then side with my direst foe?" "No, no, I side with Sir George Crofton against his own furious, unbridled passions." Neither from profession nor practice was Mr. Bevan one who was likely to force to resist Sir George, and at the moment the Baronet was about to lay hands upon him to hurl him from his path, he slipped aside. "Rash man," he said, "the time will come when you will repent this deed." The door of the study was still fast, but to the infuriated Sir George that opposed but a very frail obstacle, and with the effort of a moment he forced it open and rushed into the apartment. "Varney, monster!" he cried, "prepare to meet your doom. Your career is at an end." Mr. Bevan was after him, and in the room with him in a moment, fully expecting that some very dreadful scene would ensue, as a consequence of the unbridled passion of Sir George Crofton. Sir George Crofton was standing in the center of the apartment, with Varney's large brown cloak in his grasp, which he had dragged from the sofa, but the vampire himself was not to be seen. "Escaped!" he cried, "escaped!" "Thank Heaven, then," said Mr. Bevan, "that this roof has not been desecrated by an act of violence. Oh, Sir George, it is a mercy that time has been given to think he has escaped. I'll follow him, were it to perdition." Sir George was about to open the window and rush into the garden, thinking, of course, it was by that means by which the vampire escaped, but Mr. Bevan laid his hand upon the smooth gravel path that was immediately below the casement. "Behold," he said, "one of the first results of an autumnal night, that this coating of fleecy sleet, you see, is undisturbed. It fell about midnight. 9 hours have since elapsed, and you perceive there is no footmark upon it. And in what direction would you chase Varney the Vampyre, while he has such a start of you?" Infuriated with passion, as was Sir George Crofton, the reasonableness of this statement struck him forcibly, and he became silent. A revulsion of feeling took place. He staggered to a seat, and wept. "Yes, he is gone," he said. "Yes, the murderer of my child is gone. Vengeance is delayed, but perhaps not altogether stopped. Oh, Mr. Bevan, why did you tell me he was here?" "I do now regret having done so, but I believed him to be here, and his departure is as mysterious to me as it can be to you." Mr. Bevan cast his eyes upon the table, and there he saw a large packet addressed to himself. Sir George saw it too at the same moment, and pointing to it, said, "Is that the vampire's legacy to his new friend?" "Sir George," said Mr. Bevan, "let it suffice that the packet is addressed to me." All the good breeding of the gentleman returned, and Sir George Crofton bowed as he left the room, closely followed by the clergyman, who was as much bewildered by the disappearance of Varney as even Sir George could possibly be. He had a most intense desire to examine the packet, with the hope that there he should find some explanation or solution of the mystery, but not being aware, of course, of what it contained, he could not tell if it would be prudent to trust Sir George at that time with its contents. As may be well supposed, there was a sort of restraint in the manner of both of them after what had happened, and they did what was very rare with them both, parted without making any appointment for the future. But whatever might be the feelings of Sir George Crofton then, a little reflection would be quite sure to bring him back again to a proper estimation of what was due to such a friend as Mr. Bevan, and we cannot anticipate any serious interruption to their general friendly intercourse. The moment the clergyman found himself alone, he with eager steps went into his study, and eagerly seized upon the packet that was left to him by the vampire, the outside of which merely bore the superscription of "These to the Reverend Mr. Bevan, and strictly private." With an eagerness he tore open the envelope, and the first thing that attracted his attention was a long narrow slip of paper, on which were written the following words: "It was not my intention to trespass largely upon your hospitality. It would have been unjust, almost approaching to criminality, so to do. I could only think of taking a brief refuge in your house, so brief as should just enable me to avail myself of the shadows of night to escape from a neighborhood where I knew I should be hunted. The few hours which I have quietly remained beneath your roof have been sufficient to accomplish that object, and the papers that I leave you accompanying this contain the personal information concerning me you asked. They had been previously prepared, and are at your service. To attempt to follow me would be futile, for I have as ample means of making a rapid journey as you could possibly call to your aid, and I have the advantage of many hours' start. Under these circumstances, I have no hesitation in telling you that my destination is Naples, and that perhaps the next you hear of me will be that some stranger in a fit of madness has cast himself into the crater of a burning mountain, which would at once consume him and all his sorrows. Varney the Vampyre." One may imagine the feelings with which Mr. Bevan read this most strange and characteristic epistle, feelings that for some moments kept him a prisoner to the most painful thoughts. All that he had hoped to accomplish by the introduction of Varney to his house was lost now. He had but in fact given him a better opportunity of carrying out a terrible design, a design which now there really did not appear to be any means of averting the consummation of. "Alas! alas!" he said, "this is most grievous, and what can I do now to avert the mischief? Nothing, absolutely nothing. If it be true that he has, as he says he has, the means of hastening on his journey, all pursuit would be utterly useless." This was taking a decidedly correct view of the matter. Varney was not the sort of man, if he really intended to reach Naples quickly, to linger on his route. And then there was another view of the subject which could not but occur to Mr. Bevan, and that was, that his mentioned destination might be but a blind to turn off pursuit. End of chapter 229.
Chapter 230 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bereni. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 230. Varney gives some personal account of himself. Never had Mr. Bevan, in all his recollection, been in such a state of hesitation as now. He was a man usually of rapid resolves, and very energetic action, but the circumstances that had recently taken place were of so very remarkable a nature, that he was not able to bring to bear upon them any portion of his past experience. He felt that he could come to no determination, but was compelled by the irresistible force of events to be a spectator instead of an actor in what might ensue. "I shall hear," he thought, "if any such event happens at Naples as that to which Varney has adverted, and until I do so, or until a sufficient length of time has elapsed to make me feel certain that he will not plunge into that burning abyss, I shall be a prey to every kind of fear. And then again, as regards Sir George Crofton, what am I to say to him? Shall I show him this note, or not?" Even that was a question which he could not absolutely decide in his own mind, although he was strongly inclined to think that it would be highly desirable to do so. And while he was considering the point, and holding the note in his hand, his eye fell upon the other papers which had been enclosed with it, and addressed to him. Hoping and expecting that there he should find something that would better qualify him to come to an accurate conclusion, he took up the packet, and found that the topmost paper bore the following endorsement: "Some particulars concerning my own life." "There, then," said Mr. Bevan, "is what he has promised me." It was to be expected that Mr. Bevan should take up those papers with a very considerable amount of curiosity, and as he could not think what course immediately to pursue that would do good to Varney or anybody else, he thought he had better turn his attention at once to the documents that the vampire had left to his perusal. Telling his servant, then, not to allow him to be disturbed unless the affair was a very urgent one indeed, he closed the door of his study, and commenced reading one of the most singular statements that ever created being placed upon paper. It was as follows: "During my brief intercourse, and it has always been brief when of a confidential nature with various persons, I have created surprise by talking of individuals and events long since swallowed up in the almost forgotten past. In these few pages I declare myself more fully. In the reign of the first Charles, I resided in a narrow street in the immediate neighbourhood of Whitehall. It was a straggling, tortuous thoroughfare, going down to the Thames. It matters little what were my means of livelihood, but I have no hesitation in saying that I was a well-paid agent in some of the political movements which graced and disgraced that period. London was then a mass of mean-looking houses, with here and there one that looked like a palace compared with its humbler neighbours. Almost every street appeared to be under the protection of some great house, situated somewhere in its extent. But such of those houses as have survived the wreck of time rank now with their neighbours, and are so strangely altered that I, who knew many of them well, could now scarcely point to the place where they used to stand. I took no prominent part in the commotions of that period, but I saw the head of a king held up in its gore at Whitehall as a spectacle for the multitude. There were thousands of persons in England who had aided to bring about that result, but who were very far from expecting it, and who were the first to fall under the ban of the gigantic power they had themselves raised. Among these were many of my employers, men who had been quite willing to shake the stability of a throne so far as the individual occupying it was concerned, but who certainly never contemplated the destruction of monarchy. So the death of the first Charles and the dictatorship of Cromwell made royalists in abundance. They had raised a spirit they could not quell again, and this was a fact which the stern, harsh man Cromwell, with whom I had many interviews, was aware of. My house was admirably adapted for the purposes of secrecy and seclusion, and I became a thriving man from the large sums I received for aiding the escape of distinguished loyalists, some of whom lay for a considerable time perdu at my house, before an eligible opportunity arrived of dropping down the river quietly to some vessel which would take them to Holland. It was to offer me so much per head for these royalists that Cromwell sent for me, and there was one in particular who had been private secretary to the Duke of Cleveland, a young man merely, of neither family nor rank, but of great ability, whom Cromwell was exceedingly anxious to capture. I think there, likewise, must have been some private reasons which induced the dictator of the Commonwealth to be so anxious concerning this Master Francis Latham, which was the name of the person alluded to. It was late one evening when a stranger came to my house, and having desired to see me, was shown into a private apartment, when I immediately waited upon him. "I am aware," he said, "that you have been confidentially employed by the Duke of Cleveland, and I am aware that you have been very useful to distressed loyalists. But in aiding Master Francis Latham, the Duke's secretary, you will be permitted almost to name your own terms." I named £100, which at that time was a much larger sum than now, taking into consideration the relative value. One half of it was paid to me at once, and the other promised within 24 hours after Latham had effected his escape. I was told that at 12:30 that night, a man dressed in common working apparel, and with a broom over his shoulder, would knock at my door, and ask if he could be recommended to a lodging, and that by those tokens I should know him to be Francis Latham. A Dutch lugger, I was further told, was lying near Gravesend, on board of which, to earn my money, I was expected to place the fugitive. All this was duly agreed upon. I had a boat in readiness, with a couple of watermen upon whom I could depend, and I was far from anticipating any extraordinary difficulties in carrying out the enterprise. I had a son, about 12 years of age, who, being a sharp, acute lad, I found very useful upon several occasions, and I never scrupled to make him acquainted with any such affair as this that I am recounting. 12:30 came, and in a very few minutes after that period of time, there came a knock at my door, which my son answered, and according to arrangement, there was the person with a broom, who asked to be recommended to a lodging, and who was immediately requested to walk in. He seemed rather nervous, and asked me if I thought there was much risk. "No," said I, "no more than ordinary risk in all these cases, but we must wait half an hour till the tide turns, for just now to struggle against it down the river would really be nothing else but courting observation." To this he perfectly agreed, and sat down by my fireside. I was as anxious as he to get the affair over, for it was a ticklish job, and Oliver Cromwell, if he had brought anything of the kind exactly home to me, would as lief order me to be shot as he would have taken his luncheon in the name of the Lord. I accordingly went down to the waterside to speak to the men who were lying there with the boat, and had ascertained from them that in about 20 minutes the tide would begin to ebb in the centre of the stream, when 2 men confronted me. Practised as I was in the habits and appearances of the times, I guessed at once who they were. In fact, a couple of Oliver Cromwell's dismounted dragoons were always well known. "You are wanted," said one of them to me. "Yes, you are particularly wanted," said the other. "But, gentlemen, I am rather busy," said I. "In an hour's time I will do myself the pleasure, if you please, of waiting upon you anywhere you wish to name." The only reply they made to this was the practical one, of getting on each side of me, and then hurrying me on past my own door. I was taken right away to St. James's at a rapid pace, being hurried through one of the courtyards. We paused at a small door, at which was a sentinel. My 2 guides communicated something to him, and he allowed us to pass. There was a narrow passage without any light, and through another door, at which was likewise a sentinel, who turned the glare of a lantern upon me and my conductors. Some short explanation was given to him likewise, during which I heard the words, "His Highness," which was the title which Cromwell had lately assumed. They pushed me through this doorway, closed it behind me, and left me alone in the dark. End of chapter 230. Recording by Bereni. Chapter 231 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bereni. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3 by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 231. A Singular Interview, and the Consequences of Passion. Being perfectly ignorant of where I was, I thought the most prudent plan was to stand stock still, for if I advanced it might be into danger, and my retreat was evidently cut off. Moreover, those who brought me there must have some sort of intention, and it was better for me to leave them to develop it, than to take any steps myself, which might be of a very hazardous nature. That I was adopting the best policy I was soon convinced, for a flash of light suddenly came upon me, and I heard a gruff voice say, "Who goes there? Come this way." I walked on, and passed through an open doorway into a small apartment, in the centre of which, standing by a common deal table, on which his clenched hand was resting, I found Oliver Cromwell himself. "So, sirrah," he said, "Royalists and pestilent characters are to ravage the land, are they so? Answer me." "I have no answer to make, your highness," said I. "God's mercy, no answer, when in your own house the Duke of Cleveland's proscribed secretary lies concealed?" I felt rather staggered, but was certain I had been betrayed by someone, and Cromwell continued rapidly without giving me time to speak. "The Lord is merciful, and so are we. But the malignant must be taken by the beloved soldiers of the Commonwealth, and the gospel God-fearing men, who always turn to the Lord with short carbines, will accompany you. The malignant shall be taken from your house by you, and the true God-fearing dragoons shall linger in the shade behind. You will take him to the river side, where, the Lord willing, there will be a boat with a small blue ensign, on board of which you will place him, wishing him good speed." He paused, and looked fixedly upon me by the aid of the miserable light that was in the apartment. "What then, your highness?" I said. "Then you will probably call upon us to-morrow for a considerable sum, which will be due to you for this good service to the Commonwealth. Yes, it shall be profitable to fight the battles of the Lord." I must confess, I had expected a very different result from the interview, which I had been greatly in fear would have resulted in greatly endangering my liberty. Cromwell was a man not to be tampered with. I knew my danger, and was not disposed to sacrifice myself for Master Latham. "Your highness shall be obeyed," I said. "Ay, verily," he replied, "and if we be not obeyed, we must make ourselves felt with a strong arm of flesh. What ho! God-fearing Simpkins, art thou there?" "Yes, the Lord willing," said a dragoon, making his appearance at the door. Cromwell merely made him a sign with his hand, and he laid hold of the upper part of my arm, as though it had been in a vice, and led me out into the passage again, where the sentinels were posted. In the course of a few moments I was duly in custody of my 2 guards again, and we were proceeding at a very rapid pace towards my residence. It was not a very agreeable affair, view it in whatever light I might, but as regarded Cromwell, I knew my jeopardy, and it would be perceived that I had not hesitated a moment in obeying him. Moreover, I considered, for I knew he was generous, I should have a good round sum by the transaction, which, added to the £50 I had received from the Royalists, made the affair appear to me in a pleasant enough light. Indeed, I was revolving in my mind as I went along, whether it would not be worth while almost entirely to attach myself to the Protector. If, I reasoned with myself, I should do that, and still preserve myself a character with the Royalists, I should thrive. But it will be seen that an adverse circumstance put an end to all those dreams. When we reached the door of my house, the first thing I saw was my son wiping his brow, as if he had undergone some fatigue. He ran up to me, and catching me by the arm, whispered to me. I was so angered at the moment, that heedless of what I did, and passion getting the mastery over me, I with my clenched fist struck him to the earth. His head fell upon one of the hard round stones with which the street was paved, and he never spoke again. I had murdered him. I don't know what happened immediately subsequent to this fearful deed. All I can recollect is, that there was a great confusion and a flashing of lights, and it appeared to me as if something had suddenly struck me down to the earth with great force. When I did thoroughly awaken, I found myself lying upon a small couch, but in a very large apartment, dimly lighted, and where there were many such couches ranged against the walls. A miserable light just enabled me to see about me a little, and some dim dusky-looking figures were creeping about the place. It was a hospital that the Protector had lately instituted in the Strand. I tried to speak, but could not. My tongue seemed glued to my mouth, and I could not. And then a change came upon my sense of sight, and I could scarcely see at all the dim dusky-looking figures about me. Someone took hold of me by the wrist, and I heard one say quite distinctly, "He's entirely going now." Suddenly it seemed as if something had fallen, with a crushing influence upon my chest. And then a consciousness that I was gasping for breath, and then I thought I was at the bottom of the sea. There was a moment, only a moment, of frightful agony, and then came a singing sound, like the rush of waters, after which I distinctly felt someone raising me in their arms. I was dropped again. My limbs felt numbed and chill. An universal spasm shot through my whole system. I opened my eyes, and found myself lying in the open air, by a newly opened grave. A full moon was sailing through the sky, and the cold beams were upon my face. A voice sounded in my ears, a deep and solemn voice, and painfully distinct was every word it uttered. "Mortimer," it said, for that was my name. "Mortimer, in life you did one deed which at once cast you out from all hope that anything in that life would be remembered in the world to come to your advantage. You poisoned the pure fount of mercy, and not upon such as you can the downy freshness of heaven's bounty fall. Murderer, murderer of that being sacredly presented to your care by the great Creator of all things, live henceforth a being accursed. Be to yourself a desolation and a blight, shunned by all that is good and virtuous, armed against all men, and all men armed against thee. Varney the Vampyre." I staggered to my feet. The scene around me was a churchyard. I was gaunt and thin, my clothes hung about me in tattered remnants. The damp smell of the grave hung about them. I met an aged man, and asked him where I was. He looked at me with a shudder, as though I had escaped from some charnel house. "Why, this is Eiselden," said he. A peal of bells came merrily upon the night air. "What means that?" said I. "Why, this is the anniversary of the Restoration." "The Restoration? What Restoration?" "Why, of the royal family to the throne.
To be sure, returned this day last year. Have you been asleep so long that you don't know that?"
I shuddered and walked on, determined to make further inquiries, and to make them with so much caution that the real extent of my ignorance should scarce be surmised, and the result was to me of the most astonishing character. I found that I had been in the trance of death for nearly 2 years, and that during that period great political changes had taken place. The exiled royal family had been restored to the throne, and the most remarkable revulsion of feeling that had ever taken place in a nation had taken place in England. But personally I had not yet fully awakened to all the horror of what I was. I had heard the words addressed to me, but I had attached no very definite meaning to them.
End of chapter 231. Recording by Bereni.
Chapter 232 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 232. Varney's narrative continued. Mr. Bevan paused, when he had got thus far, to ask himself if he ought to give credence to what he read, or put it down as the raving of some person whose wits had become tangled and deranged by misfortune. Had the manuscript come to him without other circumstances to give it the air of truthfulness, he would have read it only as a literary curiosity. But it will be remembered that he had been a spectator of the resuscitation of Clara Crofton, which afforded of itself a very frightful verification of Varney's story. A story so horrible in all its details, that but for the great interest which it really possessed, he would have deeply regretted the mixing it up in his memory with brighter subjects. There was something yet to read in the papers before him, and thinking that it was better to know all at once than to leave his imagination to work upon matters so likely seriously to affect it, he resumed his perusal of these papers, which might be considered the autobiography of Varney blank. I have already said that I was not yet fully alive to the horror of what I was, but I soon found what the words which had been spoken to me by the mysterious being who had exhumed me meant. I was a thing accursed, a something to be shunned by all men, a horror, a blight, and a desolation. I felt myself growing sick and weak as I traversed the streets of the city, and yet I loathed the sight of food whenever I saw it. I reached my own house, and saw that it had been burned down. There lay nothing but a heap of charred ruins where it once stood. But I had an interest in those ruins, for from time to time I had buried considerable sums of money beneath the flooring of the lowest apartments, and I had every reason to believe, as such a secret treasure was only known to myself, that it remained untouched. I waited until the moon became obscured by some passing clouds, and then, having a most intimate knowledge of the locality, I commenced groping about the ruins, and removing a portion of them until I made my way to the spot where my money was hidden. The morning came, however, and surprised me at my occupation, so I hid myself among the ruins of what had once been my home for a whole day, and never once stirred from my concealment. Oh, it was a long and weary day. I could hear the prattle of children at play. An inn or change-house was near at hand, and I could hear noisy drinkers brawling forth songs that had been proscribed in the Commonwealth, I saw a poor wretch hunted nearly to death close to where I lay concealed, because from the fashion of his garments and the cut of his hair he was supposed to belong to the deposed party. But the long-expected night came at last. It was a dark one, too, so that it answered my purpose well. I had found an old rusty knife among the ruins, and with that I set to work to dig up my hidden treasure. I was successful and found it all. Not a guinea had been removed, although in the immediate neighbourhood there were those who would have sacrificed a human life for any piece of gold that I had hoarded. I made no inquiries about any one that had belonged to me. I dreaded to receive some horrible and circumstantial answer, but I did get a slight piece of news as I left the ruins, although I asked not for it. "There's a poor devil," said one. "Did you ever see such a wretch in all your life?" "Why, yes," said another, "and he's enough to turn one's canary sour. He seems to have come up from the ruins of Mortimer's house. By the by, did you ever hear what became of him?" "Yes, to be sure. He was shot by two of Cromwell's dragoons in some fracas or another. Ah, I recollect now. I heard as much. He murdered his son, didn't he?" I passed on. Those words seemed to send a bolt of fire through the brain, and I dreaded that the speaker might expatiate upon them. A slow, misty rain was falling, which caused the streets to be very much deserted, but being extremely well acquainted with the city, I passed on till I came to that quarter which was principally inhabited by Jews, who I knew would take my money without any troublesome questions being asked me, and also I could procure every accommodation required. And they did so, for before another hour had passed over my head, I emerged richly habited as a chevalier of the period, having really not paid to the conscientious Israelite much more than 4 times the price of the clothing I walked away with. And thus I was in the middle of London, with some hundreds of pounds in my pocket, and a horrible uncertainty as to what I was. I was growing fainter and fainter still, and I feared that unless I succeeded in housing myself shortly, I should become a prey to some one who, seeing my exhausted condition, would, notwithstanding I had a formidable rapier by my side, rob me of all I possessed. My career has been much too long and too checkered a one even to give the briefest sketch of. All I propose here to relate is how I became convinced I was a vampire, and that blood was my congenial nourishment and the only element of my new existence. I passed on until I came to a street where I knew the houses were large but unfashionable, and that they were principally occupied by persons who made a trade by letting out apartments, and there I thought I might locate myself in safety. As I made no difficulty about terms, there was no difficulty at all of any sort, and I found myself conducted into a tolerably handsome suite of rooms in the house of a decent-looking widow-woman, who had 2 daughters, young and blooming girls, both of whom regarded me as the new lodger with looks of anything but favour, considering my awful and cadaverous appearance, most probably as promising nothing at all in the shape of pleasant companionship. This I was quite prepared for. I had seen myself in a mirror. That was enough, and I could honestly have averred that a more ghastly and horrible-looking skeleton, attired in silks and broadcloth, never yet walked the streets of the city. When I retired to my chamber, I was so faint and ill that I could scarcely drag one foot after the other, and was ruminating what I should do, until a strange feeling crept over me that I should like what? Blood. Raw blood, reeking and hot, bubbling and juicy from the veins of some gasping victim. A clock upon the stairs struck 1. I arose and listened attentively. All was still in the house, still as the very grave. It was a large, old, rambling building, and had belonged at one time, no doubt, to a man of some mark and likelihood in the world. My chamber was one of 6 that opened from a corridor of a considerable length, and which traversed the whole length of the house. I crept out into this corridor, and listened again for full 10 minutes, but not the slightest sound save my own faint breathing disturbed the stillness of the house, and that emboldened me, so that, with my appetite for blood growing each moment stronger, I began to ask myself from whose veins I could seek strength and nourishment. But how was I to proceed? How was I to know in that large house which of the sleepers I could attack with safety? For it had now come to that I was to attack somebody. I stood like an evil spirit, pondering over the best means of securing a victim. And there came over me the horrible faintness again, that faintness which each moment grew worse, and which threatened completely to engulf me. I feared that some flush of it would overtake me, and then I should fall, to rise no more. And strange as it may appear, I felt a disposition to cling to the new life that had been given to me. I seemed to be acquainted already with all its horrors, but not all its joys. Suddenly the darkness of the corridor was cleared away, and soft and mellow light crept into it, and I said to myself, "The moon has risen." Yes, the bright and beautiful moon, which I had felt the soft influence of when I lay among the graves, had emerged from the bank of clouds along the eastern sky, its beams descending through a little window. They streamed right through the corridor, faintly but effectually illuminating it, and letting me see clearly all the different doors leading to the different chambers. And thus it was that I had light for anything I wished to do, but not information. The moonbeams playing upon my face seemed to give me a spurious sort of strength. I did not know until after experience what a marked and sensible effect they would always have upon me, but I felt it even then, although I did not attribute it wholly to the influence of the queenly planet. I walked on through the corridor, and some sudden influence seemed to guide me to a particular door. I know not how it was, but I laid my hand upon the lock and said to myself, "I shall find my victim here." End of chapter 232. Chapter 233 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 233. The night attack. The horrible conclusion. I paused yet a moment, for there came across me even then, after I had gone so far, a horrible dread of what I was about to do, and a feeling that there might be consequences arising from it that would jeopardize me greatly. Perhaps even then, if a great accession of strength had come to my aid, mere bodily aid, I mean, I should have hesitated, and the victim would have escaped. But, as if to mock me, there came that frightful feeling of exhaustion which felt so like the prelude to another death. I no longer hesitated. I turned the lock of the door, and I thought that I must be discovered. I left it open about an inch, and then flew back to my own chamber. I listened attentively. There was no alarm, no movement in any of the rooms. The same death-like stillness pervaded the house, and I felt that I was still safe. A soft gleam of yellow-looking light had come through the crevice of the door when I had opened it. It mingled strangely with the moonlight, and I concluded correctly enough, as I found afterwards, that a light was burning in the chamber. It was at least another 10 minutes before I could sufficiently reassure myself to glide from my own room and approach that of the fated sleeper. But at length I told myself that I might safely do so, and the night was waning fast, and if anything was to be accomplished, it must be done at once, before the first beams of early dawn should chase away the spirits of the night, and perhaps should leave me no power to act. What shall I be, I asked myself, after another 24 hours of exhaustion? Shall I have power then to make the election of what I will do, or what I will not? No, I may suffer the pangs of death again, and the scarcely less pangs of another revival. This reasoning, if it may be called reasoning, decided me, and with cautious and cat-like footsteps I again approached the bedroom door which I had opened. I no longer hesitated, but at once crossed the threshold and looked around me. It was the chamber of the youngest of my landlady's daughters, who, as far as I could judge, seemed to be about 16 years of age. But they had evidently been so struck with my horrible appearance that they had placed themselves as little as possible in my way, so that I could not be said to be a very good judge of their ages or their looks. I only knew she was the youngest because she wore her hair long, and wore it in ringlets that were loose and streaming over the pillow on which she slept, while her sister, I remarked, wore her hair plaited up and completely off her neck and shoulders. I stood by the bedside and looked upon this beautiful girl in all the pride of her young beauty, so gently and quietly slumbering. Her lips were parted, as though some pleasant images were passing in her mind, and induced a smile even in her sleep. She murmured twice, too, a word which I thought was the name of some one, perchance the idol of her young heart, but it was too indistinct for me to catch it, nor did I care to hear. That which was perhaps a very cherished secret indeed mattered not to me. I made no pretensions to her affections, however strongly in a short time I might stand in her abhorrence. One of her arms, which was exquisitely rounded, lay upon the coverlet. A neck, too, as white as alabaster, was partially exposed to my gaze. But I had no passions. It was food I wanted. I sprang upon her. There was a shriek, but not before I had secured a draught of life blood from her neck. It was enough. I felt it dart through my veins like fire, and I was restored. From that moment I found out what was to be my sustenance. It was blood, the blood of the young and the beautiful. The house was thoroughly alarmed, but not before I had retired to my own chamber. I was but partially dressed, and those few clothes I threw off me, and getting into my bed I feigned to be asleep, so that when a gentleman who slept likewise in the house, but of whose presence I knew nothing, knocked hardly at my door, I affected to awaken in a fright, and called out, "What is it? What is it? For God's sake, tell me if it is a fire." "No, no, but get up, sir, get up. There's some one in the place. An attempt at murder, I think, sir." I arose and opened the door, so by the light he carried he saw that I had to dress myself. He was but half attired himself, and he carried his sword beneath his arm. "It is a strange thing," he said, "but I have heard a shriek of alarm." "And I likewise," said I, "but I thought it was a dream." "Help! help! help!" cried the widow, who had risen, but stood upon the threshold of her own chamber. "Thieves! thieves!" By this time I had got on sufficient of my apparel that I could make an appearance, and likewise, with my sword in my hand, I sallied out into the corridor. "Oh, gentlemen, gentlemen!" cried the landlady, "did you hear anything?" "A shriek, madam," said my fellow lodger. "Have you looked into your daughter's chambers?" The room of the youngest daughter was the nearest, and into that she went at once. In another moment She appeared on the threshold again, with a face as white as a sheet. Then she wrung her hands and said, "Murder! Murder! My child is murdered! My child is murdered, Master Harding!" which I found was the name of my fellow lodger. "Fling open one of the windows and call for the watch," he said to me, "and I will search the room, and woe be to any one that I may find within its walls unauthorized." I did as he desired, and called the watch, but the watch came not. And then, upon a second visit to her daughter, the landlady found she had only fainted, and that she had been deceived in thinking she was murdered by the sudden sight of the blood upon her neck. So the house was restored to something like quiet again, and the morning began now near at hand. Mr. Harding retired to his chamber, and I to mine, leaving the landlady and her eldest daughter assiduous in their attentions to the younger. How wonderfully revived I felt! I was quite a new creature when the sunlight came dancing into my apartment. I dressed and was about to leave the house when Mr. Harding came out of one of the lower rooms and intercepted me. "Sir," he said, "I have not the pleasure of knowing you, but I have no doubt that an ordinary feeling of chivalry will prompt you to do all in your power to obviate the dread of such another night as the past." "Dread, sir?" said I. "The dread of what?" "A very proper question," he said, "but one I can hardly answer. The girl states she was awakened by someone biting her neck, and in proof of the story she actually exhibits the marks of teeth, and so terrified is she that she declares that she shall never be able to sleep again." "You astonish me." "Oh, no doubt it is sufficiently astonishing to excuse even doubts. But if you and I, who are both inmates of the house, were to keep watch to-night in the corridor, it might have the effect of completely quieting the imagination of the young girl, and perhaps result in the discovery of this nocturnal disturber of the peace." "Certainly," said I. "Command me in any way. I shall have great pleasure." "Shall it be understood, then, that we meet at 11 in your apartment or in mine?" "Whichever you may please to consider the most convenient, sir." "I mention my own, then, which is the furthest door in the corridor, and where I shall be happy to see you at 11 o'clock." There was something about this young man's manner which I did not altogether like, and yet I could not come to any positive conclusion as to whether he suspected me, and therefore I thought it would be premature to fly, when perhaps there would be really no occasion for doing so. On the contrary, I made up my mind to wait the result of the evening, which might or might not be disastrous to me. At all events, I considered that I was fully equal to taking my own part, and if by the decrees of destiny I was really to be, as it were, repudiated from society, and made to endure a new, strange, and horrible existence, I did not see that I was called upon to be particular how I rescued myself from difficulties that might arise. Relying, then, upon my own strength, and my own unscrupulous use of it, I awaited with tolerable composure the coming of night. During the day I amused myself by walking about, and noting the remarkable changes which so short a period as 2 years had made in London. But these happened to be 2 years most abundantly prolific in change. The feelings and habits of people seemed to have undergone a thorough revolution, which I was more surprised at when I learned by what thorough treachery the restoration of the exiled family was effected. The day wore on. I felt no need of refreshment, and I began to feel my own proper position, and to feel that occasionally a draught of delicious life blood, such as I had quaffed the night before, was fresh marrow to my bones. I could see when I entered the house where I had made my temporary home, that notwithstanding that I considered my appearance wonderfully improved, that feeling was not shared in by others, for the whole family shrunk from me as though there had been a most frightful contamination in my touch, and as though the very air I had breathed was hateful and deleterious. I felt convinced that there had been some conversation concerning me, and that I was rather more than suspected. I certainly then could have left the place easily and quietly, but I had a feeling of defiance which did not enable me to do so. I felt as if I were an injured being, and ought to resist a something that looked like oppression. Why, I said to myself, have I been rescued from the tomb to be made the sport of a malignant destiny? My crime was a great one, but surely I suffered enough when I suffered death as an expiation of it, and I might have been left to repose in the grave. The feelings that have since come over me held no place in my imagination, but with a kind of defiant desperation I felt as if I should like to defeat the plan by which I was attempted to be punished, and even in the face of Providence itself, to show that it was a failure entailing far worse consequences upon others than upon me. This was my impression, so I would not play the coward and fly into the first flash of danger. I sat in my own room until the hour came for my appointment with Mr. Harding, and then I walked along the corridor with a confident step, and let the hilt end of my scabbard clank along the floor. I knocked boldly at the door, and I thought there was a little hesitation in his voice as he bade me walk in, but this might have been only my imagination. He was seated at a table fully dressed, and in addition to his sword, there was lying upon the table before him a large holster pistol, nearly half the size of a carbine. "You are well prepared," said I, as I pointed to it. "Yes," he said, "and I mean to use it." "What do they want now?" I said. "What do who want?" "I don't know," I said, "but I thought I heard someone call you by name from below." "Indeed? Excuse me a moment. Perhaps they have made some discovery." There was wine upon the table, and while he was gone I poured a glass of good Rhenish down the barrel of the pistol. I wiped it carefully with the cuff of my coat, so there was no appearance upon the barrel of anything of the sort, and when he came back he looked at me very suspiciously as he said, "Nobody called me. How could you say I was called?" "Because I thought I heard you called. I suppose it is allowable for human nature to be fallible now and then." "Yes, but then I am so surprised how you could make such a mistake." "So am I." It was rather a difficult thing to answer this, and looking at me very steadily, he took up the pistol and examined the priming. Of course that was all right, and he appeared to be perfectly satisfied. "There will be 2 chairs and a table," he said, "placed in the corridor, so that we can sit in perfect ease. I will not anticipate that anything will happen, but if it should, I can only say that I will not be backward in the use of my weapons." "I don't doubt it," said I, "and commend you accordingly. That pistol must be a most formidable weapon. Does it ever miss fire?" "Not that I know of," he said. "I have loaded it with such extraordinary care that it amounts to almost an impossibility that it should. Will you take some wine?" At this moment there came a loud knocking at the door of the house. I saw an expression of satisfaction come over his face, and he sprang to his feet, holding the pistol in his grasp. "Do you know the meaning of that knocking?" said I, "at such an hour?" And at the same time, with a sweep of my arm, I threw his sword off the table and beyond his reach. "Yes," he said, rather excitedly, "you are my prisoner. It was you who caused the mischief and confusion last night. The girl is ready to swear to you, and if you attempt to escape, I'll blow your brains out." "Fire at me," said I, "and take the consequences. But the threat is sufficient, and you shall die for your temerity." I drew my sword, and he evidently thought his danger imminent, for he at once snapped the pistol in my face. Of course, it only flashed in the pan, but in one moment my sword went through him like a flash of light. It was a good blade the Jew had sold me. The hilt struck against his breastbone, and he shrieked. Bang, bang, bang came again at the outer door of the house. I withdrew the reeking blade, dashed it into the scabbard, just in time to prevent my landlady from opening the door, which she was almost in the act of doing. I seized her by the back of the neck and hurled her to a considerable distance, and then, opening the door myself, I stood behind it and let 3 men rush into the house, after which I quickly left it and was free. End of chapter 233. Chapter 234 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 234. Varney details his second death. The clergyman was perfectly amazed, as well he might be, at these revelations of the vampire. He looked up from the manuscript that Varney had left him, with a far more bewildered look than he had ever worn when studying the most abstruse sciences or difficult languages. "Can I?" he said. "Ought I to believe it?" This was a question more easily asked than answered, and after pacing a little room for a time, he thought he had better finish the papers of the vampire before he tortured his mind with any more suppositions upon the subject. The papers continued thus, and the clergyman was soon completely absorbed in the great interest of the strange recital they contained. I cared nothing as regarded my last adventure, so that it had one termination which was of any importance to me, namely, that termination which ensured my safety. When I got into the street, I walked hurriedly on, never once looking behind me, until I was far enough off, and I felt assured all pursuit was out of the question. I then began to bethink me what I had next to do. I was much revived by the draught of blood I had already had, but as yet I was sufficiently new to my vampire-like existence not to know how long such a renewal of my life and strength would last me. I certainly felt vigorous, but it was a strange, unearthly sort of vigor, having no sort of resemblance whatever to the strength which persons in an ordinary state of existence may be supposed to feel, when the faculties are all full of life and acting together harmoniously and well. When I paused, I found myself in Pall Mall, and not far off from the palace of St. James, which of late had seen so many changes, and been the witness of such remarkable mutations in the affair of monarchs, that its real chronicles would even then have afforded an instructive volume. I wandered right up to the gates of the royal pile, and then, as I was about to enter the quadrangle called the Colour Court, I was rudely repulsed by a sentinel. It was not so in the time of Cromwell, but at the moment I had quite forgotten all that was so completely changed. I always bow to authority when I cannot help it, so I turned aside at once without making any remark, but as I did so, I saw a small door open, not far from where I was, and 2 figures emerged, muffled up in brown cloaks. They looked nothing peculiar at the first glance, but when you came to examine the form and features, and to observe the manners of those 2 men, you could not but come to a conclusion that they were what the world would estimate as something great. Adventure to me was life itself, now that I had so strangely shuffled off all other ties that bound me to the world, and I had a reckless disregard of danger, which arose naturally enough from my most singular and horrible tenure of existence. I resolved to follow these 2 men closely enough, and yet, if possible, without exciting their observation. "Shall we have some sport?" said one. "I trust that the ladies," replied the other, "will afford us some. And yet they were rather coy, do you not think, on our last meeting, Rochester? Your Majesty—" "Hush, man, hush. Why are you so impudent as to majesty me in the streets? Here would be a court scandal if any eavesdropper had heard you. You were wont to be much more careful than that." "I spoke," said the other, "to recall your Majesty to care. The name of Rochester, which you pronounced, is just as likely in the streets at such a time to create court scandal as that of—" "Hush, hush! Did I say Rochester?" "Well, well, man, hold your peace if I did, and come on quickly. If we can but persuade them to come out, we can take them into the garden of the palace. I have the key of that most handy little door in the wall, which has served us more than once." Of course, after this I had no difficulty in knowing that the one speaker was the restored monarch, Charles II., and the other was his favourite and dissolute companion, Rochester, of whom I had heard something, although I had been far too short a time in the land of the living again to have any opportunity of seeing either of them before. But since they had now confessed themselves to be what they were, I could have no sort of difficulty in their recognition at any other time. I had carefully kept out of sight while the little dialogue I have just recorded took place, so that although they more than once glanced around them suspiciously and keenly, they saw me not, and having quite satisfied them that their imprudent speech had done them no harm, they walked on hurriedly in the direction of Pimlico. Little did Charles and his companion guess how horrible a being was following close upon their track. If they had done so, they might have paused, aghast, and pursued another course to that which was occupying their attention. I had a difficult part to play in following them, for although the king was incautious enough to have been safely and easily followed by any one, Rochester was not, but kept a wary eye around him, so that I was really more than once upon the point of being detected, and yet by dint of good management I did escape. Pimlico at that time was rather a miserable neighbourhood, and far, very far indeed, from being what it is now. But both the king and Rochester appeared to be well acquainted with it, and they went on for a considerable distance until they came to a turning of a narrow, dismal-looking character, bounded on each side, not by houses, but by garden walls of houses, and to judge from the solidity of the height of those walls, the houses should have been houses of some importance. "Bravo! Bravissimo!" said the king. "We are thus far into the enemy territory without observation." "So it seems," replied Rochester. "And now think you we can find the particular wall again?" "Of a surety, yes. Did I not ask them to hang out a handkerchief or some other signal by which we might be this night guided in our search? And there it flutters." The king pointed to the top of the wall, where a handkerchief waved, and something certainly in the shape of a human head appeared against the night sky, and as sweet a voice as ever I heard in my life said, "Gentlemen, I pray you go away." "What?" said the king. "Go away just as the sun has risen?" "Nay, but gentlemen," said the voice, "we are afraid we are watched." "We?" said Rochester. "You say we, and yet your fair companion is not visible." "Fair sir," said the lady, "it is not the easiest task in the world for one of us to stand upon a ladder. It certainly will not hold two." "Fair lady," said the king, "and if you can but manage to come over the wall, we will all four take one of the pleasantest strolls in the world. A friend of mine, who is a captain in the royal guard, will, at my request, allow us to walk in the private garden of St. James's Palace." "Indeed?" "Yes, fair one, that garden of which you may have heard as the favourite resort of the gay Charles." "But we are afraid," said the lady, "our uncle may come home.
It's very improper indeed, very indiscreet. We ought not to think of such a thing for a moment. In fact, it's decidedly wrong, gentlemen. But how are we to get over the wall?" The party all laughed out together. End of chapter 234. Chapter 235 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 235. The Palace Garden in St. James's. It was certainly a very ingenious speech which the lady on the wall had given utterance to, and sufficiently exemplified how inclination was struggling with prudence. It was just the sort of speech which suited those to whom it was addressed. After the laughter had subsided a little, Charles spoke. "By the help of the ladder we have," he said, "you can easily leave where you are, and as easily return. But I perceive you lack the strength to lift it over this side so as to descend." "Just so," said the lady in a low voice. "Well, I think that by the aid of my friend Smith here, I can get up to the top of the wall and assist you." Charles, by the aid of Rochester, contrived to scramble to the top of the wall, to the assistance of the two damsels who were so fearful, and yet so willing, to risk a little danger to their reputations for the purpose of enjoying a walk in the King's Garden at St. James's. The idea came across me of doing some mischief, but I did not just then interfere, as I wanted to see the result of the affair. The ladder was duly pulled over by the monarch after both the ladies had got to the top of the wall, and while Rochester steadied it below, they descended in perfect safety, and the party walked hastily from the place in the direction of St. James's. I followed them with great caution, after having removed the ladder to the wall of a garden several doors from the proper one. They went on talking and laughing in the gayest manner possible until they reached Buckingham House, and then they took a secluded path that led them close to the gardens of St. James's. Some overhanging trees shed such an impervious shadow upon all objects that I found I might as well be quite near to the party as far off. So I approached boldly, and heard that the ladies were beginning to get a little alarmed at this secret and strictly private mode of entrance to the garden. "Gentlemen," said one, "don't go into the garden if you have no proper leave to do so." "Oh, but we have," said the king. "Lately I have had proper leave, I assure you. It did happen that for some time the leave was taken away, but I have it again, along with a few other little privileges that I wanted much." "You need fear nothing," said Rochester. They all four stood in a group by the little door, while the king fumbled about with a key for some minutes before he could open the lock. At length, however, he succeeded in doing so, and the door swung open. The king dropped the key, and was unable to find it again, so leaving the door as close as they could, the party passed onwards, and I soon followed in their footsteps. The place was profoundly dark. I could feel the soft grating of fine gravel under my feet, and feeling that such a sand might betray me, I stepped aside until I trod upon a border, as I found it to be, of velvet turf. The odor of sweet flowers came upon my senses, and occasionally, as the night wind swept among the trees, there would be a pleasant murmuring sound, quite musical in its effect. The soft soil effectually prevented my footsteps from being heard, and I soon stood quite close to the parties, and found that they were at the entrance of a little gaudy pavilion, from a small painted window in which streamed a light. The ladies seemed to be rather in a flurry of apprehension, and yet the whole affair, no doubt to them, presented itself in the shape of such a charming and romantic adventure that I very much doubt if they would have gone back now had they had all the opportunity in the world so to do. Finally they all went into the pavilion. I then advanced, and finding a window that commanded a good view of the interior, I looked in, and was very much amazed at what passed. The place was decorated in a tasteful manner, although a little approaching to the gaudy, and the pictures painted in fresco upon the walls were not precisely what the strictest prudery would have considered correct, while at the same time there was nothing positively offensive in them. A table stood in the centre, and was covered with rich confectionery and wine, while the lamp that had sent the stream of light through the painted window was dependent from the ceiling by 3 massive gilt chains. Take it for all in all, it certainly was a handsome place. The king and Rochester were urging the ladies to drink wine, and now for the first time I had an opportunity of seeing the countenances of the different persons whom I had followed so far. I confess that I looked upon them with much curiosity. The ladies were decidedly handsome, and the youngest, who had fallen to the lot of the king, was very pretty indeed, and had a look of great innocence and sweetness upon her face. I pitied her. The king was a small, dark, sharp-featured man, and I thought that there was an obliquity in his vision. As for Rochester, he was decidedly ugly. His face was rather flat, and of a universal dirty-looking white colour. He certainly was not calculated to win a lady's favour. But then, for all I knew, he might have a tongue to win an angel out of heaven. Such a capacity goes much further with a woman who has any mind than all the physical graces, and women of no mind are not worth the winning. End of chapter 235.
Chapter 236 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Peckett PREST. Chapter 236. An adventure, the carbine shot, the death. Nay, I heard the king say, they ought, and no doubt do, keep choice wine here. Drink, fair one. The young girl shook her head. Nay, now, said Charles with a laugh, as he finished off himself the glass that the young girl took so small a sip of. I will convince you that I think it good. The lady with whom Rochester was conversing in a low tone had no such scruples, for she tossed off a couple of glasses as fast as they were tendered to her, and talked quite at her ease, admiring the pavilion, the pictures, the hangings and furniture, and wondering whether the king ever came here himself. Rochester began mystifying her, talking to her in a low tone, while I turned my attention to the king, and the younger and certainly more estimable female of the two. The king had been talking to her in a low tone, when she suddenly started to her feet, her face flushed with anger and alarm. "Louisa," she said, "I claim your protection. You were left in care of me. Take me home, or I will tell my uncle how you basely betrayed your trust by persuading me there was no harm in meeting those gentlemen." "Pho, the child's mad," said Louisa. "Quite mad," said the king, as he advanced towards her again. She fled to the door of the pavilion. I knew not what impulse it was that urged me on, but I left the window hastily and met her. She fell into my arms, and the light fell strongly upon me as I confronted the king. "The guard! The guard!" he shouted. Louisa pretended to faint, and the young girl clung to me as her only protector, exclaiming, "Save me! Save me! Oh, save me!" "The garden door is open," I whispered to her. "Follow me quickly. Not a moment is to be lost. We both fled together. I was about to pass through the doorway when a shot from one of the guards struck me, and I fell to the ground as if the hand of a giant had struck me down. There was a rush of blood from my heart to my head, a burning sensation of pain for a moment or two that was most horrible, and then a sea of yellow light seemed to be all around me. I remembered no more. It was afterwards that I found this was my second death, and that the favourite, Rochester, had actually directed that I should be shot rather than permitted to escape, for he dreaded more than the monarch did the exposure of his vices. I do not think that Charles, in like manner, had he been at hand, would have had my life taken, although it is hard to say what kings will do or what they will not when they are thwarted. End of chapter 236. Chapter 237 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 237. The total destruction of Varney the Vampyre, and conclusion. The manuscript which the clergyman had read with so much interest here abruptly terminated. He was left to conclude that Varney after that had been resuscitated, and he was more perplexed than ever to come to any opinion concerning the truth of the narration which he had now concluded. It was 1 week after he had finished the perusal of Varney's papers that the clergyman read in an English newspaper the following statement. We extract from the Allgemeine Zeitung the following most curious story, the accuracy of which of course we cannot vouch for, but still there is a sufficient air of probability about it to induce us to present it to our readers. Late in the evening, about 4 days since, a tall and melancholy-looking stranger arrived, and put up at one of the principal hotels at Naples. He was a most peculiar-looking man, and considered by the persons of the establishment as about the ugliest guest they had ever had within the walls of their place. In a short time he summoned the landlord, and the following conversation ensued between him and the strange guest. I want, said the stranger, to see all the curiosities of Naples, and among the rest Mount Vesuvius. Is there any difficulty? None, replied the landlord, with a proper guide. A guide was soon secured, who set out with the adventurous Englishman to make the ascent of the burning mountain. They went on then until the guide did not think it quite prudent to go any further, as there was a great fissure in the side of the mountain, out of which a stream of lava was slowly issuing and spreading itself in rather an alarming manner. The ugly Englishman, however, pointed to a secure mode of getting higher still, and they proceeded until they were very near the edge of the crater itself. The stranger then took his purse from his pocket and flung it to the guide, saying, "You can keep that for your pains and for coming into some danger with me." But the fact was that I wanted a witness to an act which I have set my mind upon performing. The guide says that these words were spoken with so much calmness that he verily believed that the act mentioned as about to be done was some scientific experiment of which he knew that the English were very fond, and he replied, "Sir, I am only too proud to serve so generous and so distinguished a gentleman. In what way can I be useful?" "You will make what haste you can," said the stranger, "from the mountain, inasmuch as it is covered with sulphurous vapours, inimical to human life, and when you reach the city you will cause to be published an account of my proceedings and what I say. You will say that you accompanied Varney the Vampyre to the crater of Mount Vesuvius, and that, tired and disgusted with a life of horror, he flung himself in, to prevent the possibility of a reanimation of his remains." Before then the guide could utter anything but a shriek, Varney took one tremendous leap, and disappeared into the burning mouth of the mountain. End of chapter 237, and end of volume 3 of Varney the Vampyre, The Feast of Blood. by Thomas Prescott Prest.